if I may, and if you forgive me, I'll start with what I think perhaps is the real issue, and in many ways what's driving, in my view, the current wave of revolutions that you're seeing around the world. If we can think of a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, one I think very easily can describe the last 30 years or even longer, post-war really, as the capture of almost every good we can think of by those at the very top of our society. So if you like, the vertical axis, whichever good it is, political, social, economic, has increasingly been captured by an elite, be it political, be it economic. And I think what's remarkable is, even given the difference in political systems, how common that elite capture is. Now, I'm not suggesting the situation in Russia is in any way comparable to the situation in the West, but if you think that the highest take of GDP by the average wage worker was in 1968, and ever since then, beginning at the bottom, it's been stagnating, and the deciles which have stagnated have gradually risen, you get a sense that something is radically awry with our whole political, economic and social settlement. And I think Michael Marmot's review on health inequalities makes the same point even more sort of quite brilliantly, really. And what he and how I read Marmot's work is essentially that even status has been captured by fewer and fewer people. And one of the reasons that, given that we're social creatures, one of the reasons status matters to us, and we know status matters from studies of primates to sort of Oscar winners, we know those who get status do much, much better, is that what's also happened in our society is status itself has concentrated, narrowed, and been captured by fewer and fewer people. So 50, 60 years ago, what it was to be recognised and respected was in many localities to work with a local football club, to be a very good school teacher, to be a good police constable, however you want to characterise it. What it is to succeed in our mass world then becomes something that's very, very difficult to achieve. Very good footballer, used to be a banker, less so, and so on and so forth. So if you like, the big society is an answer to a problem, in my view, and this is just my view. And the answer to the problem is there's something radically wrong when all the goods in our society, soft and hard, money, status, power, well-being, accrue to fewer and fewer people. And against this, sort of what I think is odd, against the whole language of destroying hierarchy, we've actually instituted an even more pervasive form of social and economic hierarchy. Against that, I want to argue for, if you will, the horizontal axis, the need actually to distribute power, assets, equity, status, networks, well-being far more radically across all of our society so that all people can genuinely participate. And what I think is so very, very interesting is that both left and right approaches have essentially all, in my view, been pro-elite. And what the big society is at its best, and it's a contested concept, not least because it's not widely understood, at its best, it's an attempt to address that situation. So there you go, that's my brief prolegomnia to the big society, and now let me canter through some slides. What I want to do is I want to name the generic problems, and then I want to give health correlates to those to show why they matter. So what I want to do is go through sort of just lack of engagement, lack of wealth, etc., show the evidence from other sectors, and then give immediate sort of health parallels to that. So in that sense, you can then track the universal and the particular. At least that's the hope. We know, generally speaking, and I think it's commonly accepted, that there's been a decline in what people call social capital, friendships, networks, from work by Robert Putnam in the US, who you might know, Bowling Alone, showing how modern technology has essentially made people far more lonely and destroyed the associative relationships that matter to people. It's work by people like Danny Dorling, Marxist professor of geography in Sheffield, who has shown, I think, quite convincingly that our weakest communities in the 1970s, in terms of social connection and the rise of anonymity, were stronger than our strongest communities today. So there seems to be a common sense, since the war, of a general destruction of our civic sensibility. Now, at one sense, you might say, well, this doesn't matter. Why should we sort of care about the rise of a certain sort of radical individualism? Well, I think what's interesting about this is take the issue of obesity. Everybody believes that, parents are responsible, food and drink manufacturers, the individual, but the state is the only vehicle that people think should address that problem. But then we've already got a causal problem here. If the agencies that are responsible are in some sense cultural, parents and the individual, then the idea that the state is the sole or exclusive answer to these problems is, I think, the problem. And so the point about the big societies is, and I'm not anti-state, I believe there's a clear role for the state, is it actually does the connect. And we can see the clear disconnect in respect of this problem. Now, what's also interesting is this lack of this idea that the recognition is a problem, but putting the responsibility for the problem elsewhere creates negative feedback systems that actually help shape the very problem that they think the state should address. Again, overweight children and the inability to recognise that. Lack of social cohesion. Now, it's very clear, I think, that we're becoming lonelier as a society and a culture. If you look at the rise of lone parent households, you look at the number of people who aren't getting married, you look at the rate of marriage breakup, you look at one of the most interesting things is the place of children at the bottom of the developed UN index for the developed countries. In the UK was at the bottom. And one of the dominant fears of children in our country is the breakup of their parents. And it's one of the great drivers of anxiety amongst children. So the compounding effect of the type of forces that are prevalent in our society is very real. So I don't think we can doubt some of the trends that are happening. Now, so we have the trend of fragmenting, isolating communities, and you all know the indices. Here's just three: socially isolated men, unmarried, less than 6 friends, living alone, more at risk of accidents, suicides, cardiovascular. Socially isolated women, who, this is before diagnosis, 66% higher risk of mortality, not from breast cancer, and it's actually for breast cancer, it's 2 times the risk of dying. Those with higher blood pressures, lonelier, etc. And you yourself will know many and other varied examples of that. Wealth matters. One of the most striking shifts is how much of the recent growth or wealth has been captured by so few. And one of the, this is why I think sort of rhetoric on the right is so interesting, because we have the rhetoric of the free market, and I'm pro-market and I view myself as such, and yet we have manifestly failed to deliver it. What's actually happened is that we've created new models of monopoly that we don't even have the conceptuality to recognise, that are actually covert products of the way state and market interacts. So regulation, for example, is always pro-monopoly, pro-incumbency, and a barrier to market entry that favours larger and larger businesses and smaller and fewer competitors. But if we create a society where more and more people are essentially wage slaves and fewer people own, and when they do own, what they own is an asset that's the only mass product most people invest in, so it's subject to our bubble economy, and as a result that asset can convert to a liability when the bubble bursts, we create a very insecure and very unbalanced economic situation. Now, again, very clear health correlates for this sort of disbursement of wealth. And even the life expectancy here is averaged out. In certain parts of Glasgow, as I'm sure you know, life expectancy is lower than the Sudan, and it varies, of course, by race, by gender, and so on. This covers even more extreme inequalities. Infant mortality. We know, and again, nobody really questions the relationship between economic inequality and health inequality. Concentration of power. Now, one of the things that is wrong in our country, not only do we created a political class where you only get in if you sort of were in student politics in your 20s, what we've actually created is a society where people feel they can't make a difference, and the inability to make a difference matters at almost every level. Because what's interesting about human beings and what we're concerned about is things around us. And yes, the ability to shape and interact things around us is hugely diminished. We always go to someone else. We always go to the local state, how our areas look, the presence of youths on the street. There's nothing we seem to be able to do that can produce a transformative difference. And that's why I think political renewal, social renewal, and economic renewal are all tied together. So for me, to encapsulate the problem is that both state welfarism, the standard approach of the left, hasn't solved poverty. If you add it up over the years, billions and billions and billions have been spent on the poor and they're still poor. Why? Because the approach we have used is one of redistribution on the basis of mostly income. We give lots of people very small amounts of money just to keep them going. But real wealth is engendered increasingly in our society by ownership and the leverage that comes from ownership that enables you to gradually capture and buy more and more. And so for me, welfarism, the standard approach of the left, and the market approach of the right have produced exactly the same phenomena: pro-elite, pro-monopoly, pro a very small number of winners where everybody else loses. And I think we've got to puncture the rhetoric of both right and left and ask why we're in a situation where, for instance, 50% of our population, in terms of available capital, not tied up in property, but in terms of capital open to them, have just 1% of all available capital. How can we create a popular capitalist democracy when so many people have so little capital and indeed so much debt? So my sense is that the big society is properly conceived an attempt to address both these issues if it's done correctly. And what it must do, again, to sort of tackle what we talked about, is we can build social capital and strengthen communal responsibility. Take, for example, the situation that I'm afraid is very prevalent in our society of old people sort of in their homes, terrified of those who are on the street. And the idea that the state can solve this is, I think, part of, just like the obesity slide earlier, is part of what's wrong with our whole approach. If in some way we can build relationships between children in the area and old people in the area, then old people wouldn't be terrified and wouldn't be so trapped in their homes and wouldn't be so lonely. And we know, for instance, 500,000 old people have Christmas dinner alone. We know that 3.5 million old people over the age of 65 don't see anybody in a week. And many of you will experience and no doubt treat all the consequences of that. So it seems clear to me we've got to create the conditions that genuinely tackle loneliness. And that has economic and social requirements and preconditions as well. So we also know from the evidence that the quality of neighbourhoods and the social environment are closely linked to a wide variety of health indicators. Broadly speaking, the nicer the area you live in, the healthier you are. And we know, it was interesting, I was listening to the Today programme this morning, and there was they were talking about exercise and how exercise itself led to a 30% reduction in bowel cancer. And we know that positive perceptions of the social environment are actually very important in actually driving exercise. So what I want to sort of demonstrate is everything is connected, but we never approach it as if it is